Hey everyone, this is Darren with Crazy Minnow Studio. Welcome back to the SALSA LipSync Suite tutorial series, and this is tutorial number 11, and we're going to be covering EmoteR. And you can see I've got the EmoteR documentation open here. This is basically just the overview, and we also have a much more in-depth guide right here, and this is going to go through all of the settings and nuances of EmoteR. We're going to do 4 videos for this EmoteR series because we want to keep the videos as short as possible and try to cover everything. So in this first video, we are going to basically go over the different sections, references, settings, and emote configuration, and then we'll dive into the areas that need some more explanation as we cover the different pools available to EmoteR. So let's go ahead and get our scene set up. I think we're going to go ahead and start out with a new scene. We'll add EmoteGuy to our scene. And EmoteGuy is a DAZ 3D model. He's free. You can go to their site, just do a search for EmoteGuy, and you can grab him and work along with this video or just use him for whatever your project needs are. All right, let's add an EmoteR module here. We can do that as I did it there, or you can also come up, make sure you have your objects selected, come up to Component, Crazy Minnow Studio, SALSA LipSync, and EmoteR, either way. And as I mentioned, we're going to go over the 3 different sections here, just like we did when we first started out with SALSA. And the first section is references. So first off, EmoteR stands for Emote Randomizer, and it began in the legacy version of SALSA, the previous version, SALSA 1, as a custom shapes add-on in Randomize. And in version 2 here, we have moved it to its own module in the suite, and in the process, it's gained a lot of new features. And as you can see here, it looks very similar when you're first starting out to what SALSA looks like when you load it up. It has the same 3 sections, and there's some differences. So first off, in references, we only need to link to a queue processor, and we highly suggest using a single queue processor per character. Don't split it over multiple queue processors per character. The queue processor handles all conflict resolution between the modules, and that's between LipSync, EmoteR, and eyes. And there is a hierarchy of conflict resolution, and SALSA basically is the king. So it overrides any expression component that might be common to one of the other modules. Then next, EmoteR. EmoteR's the second in the conflict resolution hierarchy, so it overrides other emotes and anything in eyes. And then finally, eyes pretty much overrides itself. So the conflict resolution order is SALSA overrides everything, then EmoteR, and then eyes. So you want to make sure that you have a single queue processor on your character so conflict resolution can occur there. Now you can have a single queue processor for your entire project. However, the more items that are in the queue, the longer it takes to process queue registrations because it has to search through and make sure the conflicts are resolved. All right, so we've configured our references, so we can go ahead and collapse that. We also see up here that SALSA is not linked. We covered this in video number 8, emphasis emotes. You can watch that video if you need to refresh yourself. So we'll look at settings, and random emote settings have to have at least one random emote configured, and you can see we don't have any emotes configured down here. So there needs to be at least one configured before you get the random emote settings. So since we are going to have a separate video on random emotes, we will cover the settings for random emote in that video. And then next we have the common settings, and these settings apply to all emotes that pass through EmoteR engine, even emphasizer emotes, random emotes, sequencers, any of them. The only emotes that this does not apply to are the emotes that are fired by eyes. So the eyes module actually does register an emote class with the queue processor, but it is handling all of that on its own. It doesn't pass through the EmoteR engine at all. So hold time variation, what is that? Okay, let's go ahead and pull up our documentation. And we are going to load up the diagram that we demonstrated in the events tutorial. So hold is one of the timing, and it's really only present in EmoteR, and that's because EmoteR is one of the only modules that handles round trip emotes that when they fire, they're all self-contained, they animate on, they hold for a specified time, that time may be 0, and then they animate off. And the queue processor, once they're registered, the queue processor handles the whole life cycle. So that's why there's a hold timing. And this hold time duration variation allows you to specify a more random nature to that hold time, regardless of what you have configured. Let me go ahead and configure an emote here. Let's see what this emote looks like. Okay, kind of a cheesy emote. All right. In our timings, we can specify a hold time. And as you saw, that is this particular time here. So after the emote has animated on, it will hold for a certain amount of time and then it will animate off, assuming it's a round trip emote. And what this hold time does is it actually overrides whatever times are present in here. And each time it is fired, it is given a random value between these two extents here. So in this particular instance, it would be 1/10 to 1/2 of a second. And what we have configured is 1/2 of a second. We had a request to add some sort of method to exempt emotes from this variation. And so we did add that in the latest release 2.2.2, which is the one we're working in right now. And it is right here, this hold variation exempt. So if I have this unchecked, then we don't even get that option because there's no need for it since we aren't using hold time variations. But once we do, we can select this individually on each emote. So if we have multiple emotes, they each have their own hold time variation exemption. I've got it set here and not in this one. So that hold time variation would apply to emote 1, but not emote 0. Now let's go ahead and remove that. And then the next setting is very similar to this one. And again, it applies to all emotes configured in EmoteR. And it is a fractional variation. And what this means is whatever the extent is configured for each emote, it will apply a dynamic value to it that will reduce it from whatever the maximum is set to. So whatever this particular emote is set to, and we can preview again, we see it's this cheesy grin thing, and we can actually set this to whatever we want as far as our max goes. Let's just say, well, let's just leave it at 1 for right now. And this fractional variation, each time it's fired, will produce a value that is a fraction of whatever this max extent is. And this basically applies to the whole emote. So if we have multiple components on here, and this particular one, let's say we did nerd as well. These don't necessarily make any sense, but I'm just applying these here. And we had nerd down to just a little bit here, and we had this one. This is basically what we wanted to create for an expression. What would happen is, and I can demonstrate this with the expression dynamics, we would get a random value with this bias being the minimum. So if we produce a random value, it is going to guarantee at least 50% of the value will be fired. So at least 50% of what we see right here, which is about this, okay? So that would be the minimum amount of the emote we would see, and then it would be random throughout the rest of this range, which means it could be anywhere. It basically will be anywhere from these ranges. This is what it would look like. Okay, so I think that explains fractional variation. And as I mentioned, fractional variation applies to any emote that is fired through EmoteR. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn this off. And there is one last settings option that is available. We don't see it here because we don't have SALSA linked. And when SALSA is linked to this EmoteR, then we get another option down here that is the chance, the emphasis chance, and that is also covered in tutorial 8 on emphasis emotes. Okay, so that covers our settings. So now let's look at emote configuration and primarily what the difference is between the configuration here in EmoteR and in SALSA. So first off, we notice that we have a memberships section here, which we have introduced in some of the previous videos because we've used EmoteR to demonstrate some stuff. There basically are 4 pools or memberships of emotes, and by default, all emotes that are configured are added to the manual pool. That will be covered in another video. We'll show how to script that out. Then we have the random emote pool, which we'll cover in the next video. We have the lip-sync emphasizer emote pool, which we already covered in tutorial number 8. And then we have repeater emotes, and we've used these to demonstrate in the events video, tutorial number 9. And we'll go over this in a little bit more detail in another video in this EmoteR series as well. So we have 4 pools again. That's manual, which all emotes are part of the manual pool. And then we have random, lip sync, and repeater. And we can see what memberships each emote has very easily by clicking on the collection display mode here. And then we can see we've got random, emphasizer, and repeater. So if we had, let's go back to this, if we had set this one up for repeater and random, and this one was only lip sync emphasis, if we go back in here, then we see what we've got here. And once you've selected a repeater, you get these other options here that are basically repeater options. Well, again, we'll cover this in another video. And an emote can be part of one or more pools. It doesn't have to be a part of any of these pools. It will always be a part of the manual pool, and it can be a member of all of these different pools. It just depends on what your needs are for your project. Okay, so that's our memberships. Then we have this expression dynamics, and I demonstrated this a little bit earlier. This is on a per emote basis, and this allows you to configure multiple components, and then you can kind of dial it in. Like if you feel like you got a little crazy with it, you can pull it down some. Maintain persistence. This basically applies to any emotes that might be governed or externally modified by some sort of animation engine or programmatic control. And as long as those external influencers occur in the update cycle, all of our animation updates occur in the late update cycle, so we can override them. And while they are operating, they will be overridden, but once the queue releases them, they'll be snapped back to whatever influencer is acting upon them, whether that's mechanism or some sort of programmatic control. So we can enable this, and this will keep the emote components in the queue so that even if they're fully animated on or off, EmoteR will maintain control of them in the late update cycle. Again, if you have some other external process that is modifying these also in the late update cycle, then there will be fighting that occurs. But if you're letting EmoteR handle it, you can enable this. Now, this does keep more components in the queue, and that means that there will be a little bit more processing involved each time any of the modules that are using the queue are registering a component, because it has to search through the current list and establish an element of hierarchy and override. It's a relative performance hit. It really is. We're only talking about milliseconds. It maybe not even 1 or 2, depending on how many components are actually in the queue. All right, the next difference between the EmoteR configuration and SALSA, and even in eyes, will be that we have some different animation timings available. So the first one is the hold timing. And as we saw, it is the amount of time that a round trip emote maintains itself before it begins animating off. So it's how long it maintains its on position before it hits the beginning of the exit process for the animation, so which is 0.3. So that's the point at which it starts animating off. And then we have this delay. The delay operates in front of the on timing. So it gives this particular component, and this is configured on a component by component basis, it gives a particular component a delay time before it starts animating on once this emote is triggered. So let's say we want to open our mouth and then stick out our tongue, and we want that to be a single emote. And then we want to pull our tongue back in and then close the mouth. So we'll try to demonstrate that. I'll do that here. And this one, call it tongue out. And we'll go ahead and set this up as a repeater so that we can see what it looks like. And we'll give it 1 second to animate on, 2 seconds to hold, and 1 second to animate off. So this will be the first one. We're going to open our mouth here. Mouth yell, that's the one we want. So what this will do is open the mouth, and then we will add another component that will do tongue out. Go ahead and preview this again. So ultimately it's going to look like this, but what we want to do is open the mouth first and then stick out the tongue. So we will delay this. We'll give the mouth approximately, so it's going to take half a second, or I'm sorry, it's going to take a full second to animate the mouth open. So we will give it 3/4 of a second to get the mouth open before we start sticking the tongue out. And then we will only hold that for, let's give it 1/4 of a second. And then it will delay for 3/4 of a second. Then it'll take a second to animate on. And then it will only hold for 1/4 of a second, where this one's holding for 2. And then it will start its animation off. So we should have plenty of time to get the tongue back in the mouth before we start closing the mouth. So let's see how this works. So we see the mouth opens, the tongue comes out, the tongue goes back in, and the mouth closes. Okay, so there is a small bug in version 2.2.2 that actually applies this delay to both the on cycle and the off cycle. So what you see here is it looks like instead of holding it for 3/4 of a second, it's holding it much longer, and it is because it's adding this delay on here. So when we cycle through this, tongue comes out, and instead of being 3/4 of a second, it's 1.5 seconds. So it puts the timing off. And we can see that even clearer if we set this hold time to 0. So it should animate on and then immediately animate off. And it doesn't. It holds for this 3/4 of a second. Same. All right, so the good news is we have a fix for that, and it is going to be in SALSA 2.2.3, which might actually be available by the time you see this video. So I'm going to go ahead and update our instance to 2.2.3. Okay, so let's see if this fixes our problem. So now we have a hold time of 0, and we should see it immediately close. And then the tongue goes back in and it closes. So there is 0 hold time. The delay is not applying to the hold as well. Okay, and then the only other difference is we have 2 additional controller types here. One is animator, and we'll do a video on that in the future. And the other is event, and we already did a video on that. It was tutorial number 9 called events. So that should do it for this video. And in the next video, we are going to cover random emote. So we'll see you in the next video.